60 Hz, the legacy standard. 60 Hz means the screen draws a new image 60 times per second. Each refresh window is about 16.67 milliseconds long, which is how long each frame sits on screen before the next one replaces it. That number matters because it's the baseline timing that everything else in the chain must fit into. If a pixel transition takes longer than roughly half that window, you start smearing the motion across frames, and it looks soft when you pan or scroll. This is why 60 Hz feels fine for static work and video, but looks sluggish in fast games and quick UI motion. Most video you watch is already low frame rate by design. Movies are typically 24 frames per second, broadcast video is often 30 frames per second, and plenty of streaming content still targets those standards. A 60 Hz display cleanly repeats these frames without judder when the player uses proper cadence, which is a fancy way of saying show each frame for an even amount of time. This is why a basic office monitor handles films and news just fine, even if it won't make your mouse feel like a lightsaber. Motion blur at 60 Hz mostly comes from sample and hold. The display holds each frame steady for that whole 16.67 milliseconds, while your eyes keep tracking the moving object. Your visual system blends the held frames into a blur trail. Faster refresh shortens each hold time, which shortens the blur, even if pixel response is already fast. This is also why an instant response panel can still look blurry at 60 Hz. The blur is in the timing, not just the pixels. Power is the one solid win for 60 Hz on desktops and laptops. Fewer refreshes mean fewer updates and slightly lower draw, all else equal. The exact savings depend on panel tech and brightness, but manufacturers and lab tests consistently note higher refresh rates use more power because they update more often. Translation: if you want maximum battery life, 60 Hz is the sensible shoes setting. Bottom line for 60 Hz, great for documents, web, video, and budget builds. Tolerable for casual games. And obviously not ideal if you care about motion clarity, input feel, or competitive response. If that last sentence stung a little, you just outgrew 60 Hz. 75 Hz. First step up. 75 Hz redraws the image 75 times per second, so each frame is visible for about 13.33 milliseconds. That shorter hold time trims motion blur compared to 60 Hz because your eyes have less time to smear a held frame while tracking movement. It is not night and day, but you can see it immediately when you scroll text or swing the camera in a game. Think of it as the "why does the mouse suddenly feel less sticky?" tier. Input feel also improves because the display is sampling and showing updates more often. Even small bumps in refresh rate can shave a few milliseconds off how long it takes for a change to appear on screen, which is why 75 Hz often feels snappier on the desktop and in lighter games. You do not need an esports rig to notice that. Your cursor and window animations will tell you for free. You still will not buy 75 Hz for competitive play. Most panels at this tier are tuned for productivity first, with motion handling that is adequate rather than aggressive. Many office-class monitors top out here because it is an easy upgrade over 60 Hz without raising cost or power much, which is nice for IT departments and anyone who prefers their electricity bill to remain boring. Variable refresh rate support sometimes shows up at 75 Hz on entry monitors, and when it does, it helps smooth out frame rate dips from integrated graphics or modest GPUs by matching the screen's refresh to the game's frame output. The result is fewer tears and fewer little stutters when your frame rate wobbles around the cap. If you see FreeSync or G-Sync compatibility on a 75 Hz model, that is what it is doing. Bottom line for 75 Hz, a cheap, tangible quality of life upgrade over 60 Hz for scrolling, UI motion, and casual gaming. If you are watching movies or typing documents, it will look exactly as thrilling as 60 Hz. If you live in spreadsheets by day and play light titles by night, it is the sensible bump. 100 and 120 Hz. The modern sweet spot. At 100 to 120 Hz, the refresh window drops to 10 or 8.3 milliseconds per frame. That cuts perceived motion blur nearly in half compared to 60 Hz. And the difference is obvious the instant you scroll text, move a window, or pan a camera. Everything feels detached from lag, smoother, cleaner, and more responsive, without needing absurd hardware or niche monitors. This range is also where adaptive sync technologies like G-Sync and FreeSync start to shine. Adaptive sync FreeSync dynamically adjusts the refresh rate to match the frame rate output from your graphics card. Instead of the screen refreshing on a strict timer, it waits until the next frame is ready. That prevents tearing, where parts of two frames appear on screen at once, and stutter, where inconsistent timing makes motion jumpy. HDMI variable refresh rate does the same for consoles, though under a friendlier name. Monitors in this bracket usually offer wider color gamuts and better panels, IPS, VA, or OLED, that maintain image quality while moving fast. Many high-end productivity monitors target 100 or 120 Hz because even if you never game, your cursor, animations, and transitions look dramatically more fluid, which is easier on the eyes during long work sessions. In gaming, 120 Hz aligns nicely with modern frame rate targets. Consoles like PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X output up to 120 frames per second in supported titles. PC hardware can often maintain triple-digit frame rates without extreme power draw, so you get the motion clarity benefits without punishing your GPU or your electric bill. At the same time, this range marks the first meaningful step into the high refresh territory. You start to pay more attention to input latency. Input lag generally decreases as refresh rate rises because the screen updates sooner after receiving new information. The gap between 60 and 120 Hz can shave 10 milliseconds off the average input delay, which is roughly 1/3 of a typical frame's lifetime. For most people, that's the difference between feels fine and feels instant. It is no coincidence that most laptops labeled gaming now ship with 120 Hz or higher panels. It has become the practical baseline for smoothness in 2025. Going beyond this point brings diminishing returns unless you play competitively, but up to here, nearly everyone benefits. 144 Hz, the gaming standard. At 144 Hz, each frame lasts about 6.9 milliseconds. That is less than half the persistence time of 60 Hz, which makes fast motion feel much sharper and cleaner. The effect is immediately visible in first-person shooters, racing games, or even just dragging windows around. Everything snaps to motion, instead of smearing across the screen. The 144 Hz tier became the de facto gaming standard because it balanced cost, panel availability, and performance. It's fast enough that input latency drops to near professional levels, but not so extreme that only high-end graphics cards can keep up. Most mid-range GPUs can drive popular competitive games like Counter-Strike, Valorant, or Apex Legends comfortably above 144 frames per second, allowing you to actually use the extra refresh headroom. This refresh rate also drastically reduces screen tearing and judder even without adaptive sync, since the higher update frequency makes mismatched frames less noticeable. When paired with adaptive sync technologies, G-Sync, FreeSync, or HDMI VRR, the experience becomes almost perfectly smooth, as the monitor adjusts each refresh cycle to precisely match the frame being rendered. From a usability standpoint, the jump from 120 to 144 Hz may sound small, but it is enough that seasoned gamers can feel it. Mouse movements become razor-precise, aiming feels more connected, and even desktop interactions gain a subtle liquid quality. It's also where manufacturers start tuning their panels for faster pixel transitions. The gray-to-gray response time must stay below roughly half of the frame window, around 3 milliseconds, to prevent ghosting or smear. 144 Hz panels are available across almost every resolution tier. 1080p for budget builds, 1440p for balanced setups, and even 4K for enthusiasts who have the horsepower. Most modern DisplayPort 1.4 connections can handle 1440p at 144 Hz with 10-bit color, though 4K at 144 requires display stream compression to squeeze through the bandwidth limits. This tier also marked the start of the spec war among gaming monitor makers. Every brand wanted to advertise higher numbers, even if the panel was just overclocked or slightly tweaked, which leads us directly into the next category. 165 Hz, the overclocked 144. 165 Hz sounds impressive, but here's the secret. Most of these panels are just 144 Hz models pushed a little faster. Manufacturers realized that if a panel could reliably handle 6.9 milliseconds per frame, shaving that down to 6 milliseconds was mostly a firmware tweak plate and a new sticker. And thus, the 165 Hz gaming monitor was born. Each refresh at this speed takes about 6 milliseconds, which barely moves the needle on motion clarity compared to 144 Hz. You might notice a slightly snappier cursor and a marginally shorter input delay, maybe 1 millisecond, if you run a stopwatch for fun. For actual human perception, the gain is microscopic. It exists mostly to give product pages something shiny to print in bold letters. Still, there is no real harm in it. The extra refresh headroom can sometimes help if your GPU fluctuates between 140 and 160 frames per second, because the screen can display those odd frame rates without dropping frames or tearing. In that sense, it acts as a subtle buffer zone rather than a true performance leap. Technically, a higher refresh rate means more power draw and more data pushed through the cable, but the difference between 144 and 165 is trivial. Most modern DisplayPort 1.4 connections can carry 1440p at 165 Hz with full color depth, and even HDMI 2.1 can handle it if the cable is decent. Where the 165 Hz tier occasionally shines is marketing variety. Ultra-wide monitors and curved panels often target this number because it fits neatly between mid-range gamer and competitive aspirant. You'll find it on countless VA panels where 240 Hz would be overkill and 144 Hz just sounds boring. So yes, 165 Hz technically exists. No, it won't transform your gaming life. But if you happen to buy one, don't worry. You didn't waste money, you just bought a slightly caffeinated 144 Hz panel, 240 Hz, the competitive edge. At 240 Hz, each frame lasts about 4.16 milliseconds. That's nearly one-third the frame persistence of 144 Hz, which means your screen is updating so often that motion blur from eye tracking starts to feel almost non-existent. It's not cinematic, it's surgical. This tier exists for one reason: esports. When every millisecond counts, the faster refresh translates directly into lower input latency and smoother frame delivery. A competitive player can react to what's on screen a few milliseconds earlier, and that's often the margin between landing a headshot or spectating your teammate. Games like Counter-Strike 2, Valorant, and Overwatch 2 are designed to take advantage of these refresh rates. Their engines can spit out hundreds of frames per second on mid-range GPUs, letting players actually see and feel the difference. When frame timing aligns with the refresh window, input lag can drop below 5 milliseconds, which makes the experience feel eerily immediate, like your mouse is wired into your nervous system. However, there's a catch. To make a 240 Hz monitor worth it, your PC has to consistently push 240 frames per second. If your GPU can't keep up, the whole benefit evaporates, and you're left with a bragging number that only your refresh rate counter enjoys. That's why these displays are almost always paired with fast 1080p or 1440p resolutions, not 4K. The GPU load must stay light enough to feed the beast. 240 Hz panels also demand tight pixel response times. At 4 milliseconds per frame, the pixels need to transition within roughly 2 milliseconds or less to avoid visible trailing. That's why this tier is dominated by TN, IPS, and now OLED technologies. VA panels rarely switch fast enough to keep up without smearing dark tones. And yes, power usage goes up again. Doubling refresh means doubling the amount of data sent per second. DisplayPort 1.4 can handle 1080p and 1440p at 240 Hz, but 4K at 240 requires the newer DisplayPort 2.1 or HDMI 2.1 interfaces with high bandwidth compression. For casual users, this refresh rate is pure overkill. For competitive players chasing every last millisecond, this is home turf. Everyone else is just visiting. 360 and 480 Hz, the extreme tier. At 360 Hz, each frame lasts about 2.77 milliseconds. At 480 Hz, it drops to 2.08 milliseconds. That's shorter than the time it takes to blink, sneeze, or question why you bought a monitor faster than your brain. These displays exist almost entirely for professional esports. They're built to minimize input delay to the absolute limit that current technology and human reaction time can meaningfully exploit. For reference, the average human visual response time is around 200 to 250 milliseconds. The difference between 360 and 480 Hz changes the display's delay by less than 1 millisecond. It's measurable, but barely. That said, the perceived smoothness is still real. Rapid motion, like tracking targets in a shooter or spinning the camera, looks cleaner because there are more intermediate frames filling the gaps. It's the same principle as flipping through a flipbook faster. More pages per second means more continuity. You won't see more things happening, but everything appears slightly more cohesive. These monitors often use OLED or high-end TN panels, as both can switch pixels within 1 millisecond or less. OLEDs especially shine here because they have near-zero response time, eliminating the traditional gray-to-gray smearing that plagued older technologies. However, running an OLED at 480 Hz requires an obscene amount of bandwidth and power, which is why most of these displays cap at 1080p. A big technical hurdle is interface bandwidth. DisplayPort 2.1 and HDMI 2.1 are just barely enough to deliver 1080p at 480 Hz without heavy compression. Anything higher, like 1440p or 4K, would exceed the cable's data limit. This is why early 480 Hz prototypes either lower color depth or use display stream compression to make it possible at all. Realistically, only professional players can justify them. For everyone else, the law of diminishing returns kicks in brutally hard. 144 Hz already removed most visible blur. 240 Hz removed most perceivable lag. 360 and 480 are engineering trophies. Unless your income depends on reflexes, your monitor is now officially faster than you. Adaptive Sync Variable Refresh Rate. Adaptive Sync, also called variable refresh rate, is a technology that lets the monitor change its refresh rate dynamically to match your graphics card's output in real time. Normally, a display refreshes on a strict schedule, 60, 120, or 240 times per second, no matter when new frames are ready. When the GPU can't deliver frames exactly in sync with that rhythm, you get tearing, where the top and bottom halves of the screen show different frames, or stutter when frames are delayed. Adaptive Sync fixes that by making the display wait. When the GPU finishes rendering a frame, the monitor refreshes immediately. When the GPU slows down, the monitor slows down too. The refresh rate floats between a minimum and maximum range, usually 48 Hz, up to whatever the panel's maximum is. The result is motion that feels fluid, without the judder or sliced frames you get from fixed timing. There are several brands of this same concept. AMD's FreeSync is based on the OpenV ESA Adaptive Sync standard, meaning it works over standard DisplayPort and HDMI cables without special hardware. NVIDIA's G-Sync started as a proprietary system that used a dedicated hardware module inside the monitor for tighter frame timing, though most modern G-Sync-compatible displays simply use Adaptive Sync under certification. HDMI Variable Refresh Rate (VRR) works similarly for consoles, syncing display updates with console frame output, which is why 120 Hz TVs now advertise it so proudly. One caveat: VRR doesn't mean instantaneous updates. It's still limited by the refresh window. If your GPU drops below the monitor's minimum VRR threshold, say 48 Hz, the display may double frames to maintain synchronization. This prevents stutter, but it can introduce a tiny bit of lag. Still, it's far less disruptive than tearing. VRR is now standard on nearly all gaming monitors and high-end TV, and it's arguably more important for smooth gameplay than raw refresh speed. A 120 Hz screen with good adaptive sync often feels smoother than a 165 Hz panel locked to fixed timing, because every frame lands exactly where it should. So yes, the future of smooth visuals isn't necessarily faster refresh, it's smarter refresh. Motion clarity and response times, MPRT versus GTG. Refresh rate alone doesn't define how clear motion looks. The screen might be refreshing fast, but if the pixels can't change color quickly enough, you'll still see trails or smearing behind moving objects. This is where pixel response time comes in, and why you'll see two confusing specs on monitor sheets: GTG and MPRT. GTG means gray to gray, how long it takes a pixel to change from one shade of gray to another. It's a shorthand for overall transition speed, because every color change passes through gray at some point. Lower GTG times mean less visible ghosting. Manufacturers love quoting 1 millisecond GTG, but that's usually measured under ideal lab conditions and doesn't represent the slower transitions between complex colors. MPRT means moving picture response time, and it measures something completely different: how long a frame remains visible to your eyes. MPRT depends on the refresh rate and how the backlight behaves. A screen that holds each frame for 16 milliseconds at 60 Hz will show more motion blur than one that holds each frame for 8 milliseconds milliseconds at 120 Hz, even if their GTG times are identical. In other words, GTG is how fast pixels can move, while MPRT is how long your eyes keep seeing them. A monitor can have a blazing 1 millisecond GTG, but still look blurry if its MPRT is high, because sample and hold displays, like almost every LCD, and OLED keep each frame lit the whole time. Some monitors reduce MPRT with a technique called backlight strobing, where the backlight flickers off briefly between frames to reduce the time each image is visible. It can drastically improve motion clarity, but it also lowers brightness, and sometimes introduces flicker visible to sensitive users. It also cannot operate simultaneously with adaptive sync, because one feature needs steady timing, while the other changes it constantly. OLED panels sidestep much of this problem. Since each pixel emits its own light and can turn off nearly instantly, their MPRT is naturally low, and motion appears clearer even without strobing. That's one reason competitive players are moving toward OLED displays, despite their price and burn-in risks. So when you read monitor specs, remember, refresh rate tells you how often images update, GTG tells you how fast pixels can change, and MPRT tells you how long your eyes keep seeing them. The marketing team won't tell you that part, but your retinas will. Display interface limits. Why your cable might be the bottleneck. All the refresh rate bragging in the world means nothing if your video cable can't deliver enough data. Each frame your GPU sends is a package of pixels, width times height, color depth, and refresh rate multiplied together. At high resolutions, that data rate explodes. The display interface must have enough bandwidth to push all those pixels across every second without dropping quality or skipping frames. Take 4K at 240 Hz as an example. That's 3,840 by 2,160 pixels refreshed 240 times per second, over 2 billion pixels per second. When you include 10-bit color and standard overhead, you're looking at nearly 80 gigabits per second of data. That's far beyond what HDMI 2.0 or DisplayPort 1.4 can handle uncompressed. This is why new high-end monitors require HDMI 2.1 or DisplayPort 2.1, both of which push bandwidth well past 70 gigabits per second with compression standards like DisplayStream Compression DSC. DisplayPort 1.4 can still manage impressive speeds. It handles 1440p up to 240 Hz or 4K up to 144 Hz using DSC, which visually compresses data with no perceptible quality loss. HDMI 2.1, the standard found on most gaming consoles and modern GPUs, supports 4K up to 120 Hz uncompressed and can stretch to 240 Hz if compression is enabled, but only if your cable and devices both support full 48 gigabit throughput. Cheap or older cables are often the silent culprit. Many HDMI 2.1 cables sold online are rebranded 18 gigabit HDMI 2.0 versions. They can physically fit the port but choke the data stream, causing your display to silently drop to 60 Hz or disable HDR to stay within bandwidth limit. The monitor never tells you, it just obeys physics. If you've ever wondered why your new display refuses to show 240 Hz, it's probably your cable gasping for air. DisplayPort generally avoids that problem thanks to certification standards and locking connect, but even then, older DP 1.2 cables won't deliver enough bandwidth for 4K at high refresh. Always check the rated speed before assuming it's just a wire. Bandwidth also explains why most ultra-high refresh monitors stick to 1080p or 1440p. Pushing 480 Hz at 4K would exceed even DisplayPort 2.1 limits without heavy compression, which current GPUs aren't built to handle efficiently. In short, until cables and interfaces evolve again, physics dictates that resolution and refresh must compromise. So if your monitor ever refuses to hit its advertised refresh rate, don't blame the panel, blame the wire. It's doing its best impression of a garden hose trying to feed a fire hydrant. I made an awesome video about every smartphone screen refresh rate, so don't miss it, okay?